In my electorate of Casey, we know quite a bit about emergency response and disaster resilience. We've experienced more than our fair share of bushfires, storms, and other natural disasters. The 2009 Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria caused widespread devastation and the greatest loss of life from fire in Casey in known history. 173 people tragically lost their lives. 414 were injured. More than 1 million wild and domesticated animals were lost, and 450,000 hectares of land were burned. More than 19,000 CFA members worked tirelessly, not just in the immediate emergency, but for the weeks and months to finally extinguish the last blaze. And many thousands of Victorians and millions of Australians came together to support those affected, including in my electorate of Casey, for the weeks, months and years of our physical and psychological recovery. Deputy Speaker, as Australians become more urbanised, the fringes of cities encroach further into the bush, and it is here in the frontier zone between bush and city that bushfires do much of their damage. It was in this edge environment that my local communities of Hillsville and Yarra Glen that the Black Saturday bushfires inflicted the damage that made them some of the most destructive in Australian history. We cannot only measure the destruction in loss of property or even loss of life. From experience, I can confirm that the devastation is much greater. The profound loss of life and injury to family and friends is accompanied by the loss of homes and the memories they contained. Businesses that have been lovingly run for generations, the complete alteration of familiar landscapes, and the sense of foreboding that such a disaster could happen again. I saw how this affected my family, my friends, and my community as the fire-ravaged regions of Casey. Doctors and psychologists reported a rise in suicides among bushfire survivors, along with alcohol and drug abuse and addictive behaviour such as gambling. Deputy Speaker, the importance of the Emergency Response Fund, now to be called the Disaster Relief Fund, cannot be denied. This bill essentially repurposes the Emergency Response Fund, turning it into an ongoing source of funding for natural disasters, resilience and risk reduction, to be known as the Disaster Relief Fund. This bill is little more than a change in acronym, as it will continue to be managed by the Future Fund Management Agency within the Department of Finance. The Emergency Response Fund was set up by the Coalition Government in 2019 as an investment fund intended to grow over time to maximise the Commonwealth's capacity to support states and territories as they respond to major natural disasters into the future. Deputy Speaker, under previous legislation, the government could access up to $50 million for pre-disaster resilience measures and up to $150 million for emergency response and recovery each financial year. The government made an election commitment to revamp the fund to spend $200 million annually on disaster prevention and resilience. It allows the DRF to provide up to $200 million per financial year for these initiatives. In my first speech, I spoke of my commitment to making sure the effects of natural disasters are minimised due to effective resilience planning and preparation. And this bill will ensure the coalitions and my personal promise to my community will continue to support them through the tough times. One such recent example was on the night of the 9th of December 2021. Families hunkered down in their living rooms across the Dandenong Ranges as ferocious winds roared and the crash of trees breaking and falling thundered around them. Even houses that weren't hit by the gigantic trees falling shook with the impact. It was a genuine miracle that nobody was killed. In that one terrifying night, 177 properties were damaged, 76 of which were deemed uninhabitable. Thousands of trees fell across roads and power lines, trapping many in the Dandenongs. Power was cut to more than 6,500 homes, including my own, for 12 days, while phone and internet services also went down across the Dandenong Ranges and surrounding towns. Townships such as Kalorama, Monbulk and Mount Dandenong were hardest hit, with 373 hectares of the Dandenong Ranges impacted. More than a year later, there are still many who have not been able to rebuild or have run into financial or practical obstacles preventing them from returning to their homes. And I've met with many of these constituents, and it's heartbreaking to hear their stories as they're trapped in this situation of not being able to move forward. And one community example is the Mount Dandenong Preschool, which has been operating out of the Olinda Primary School since their old site remains unrepaired and condemned since the storm. The trauma to the children, parents and staff is ongoing, having to see it regularly as they drive past, covered in a tarpaulin and fallen trees. As the local mayor, Jim Child, said recently, "It was a crisis that tested us beyond belief, but people in this region are resilient, and we know how to look after each other." This is clear when you see the community groups that responded out of such a tragedy and loss. New community bonds that rose in the form of rescue logs and Treasure in Our Trees, to organisations that are taking those fallen trees to create new habitats for schools, so the children in those primary schools across Casey can have a new environment to play in, but also help them to recover from the trauma that they've experienced. And many more community organisations that banded together at the time and since. An effective emergency management is as much about planning and preparation as it is about response, clean-up and recovery. In Casey, we have unfortunately extensive experience with emergencies. But as is so often the case in Australia, amazing people come together to build resilience, to protect their families, their businesses and their communities. The local Yarra Ranges Council has led this emergency response in Casey, and they've developed a new program called the Resilience Yarra Ranges Project to protect our communities by increasing disaster preparedness, risk management, recovery and future resilience. And I'm very proud, Deputy Speaker, to say that the previous coalition government committed $10 million to this plan to increase our community's ability to mitigate, avoid, withstand and recover from the effects of bushfires, floods and storms. This project is going to be delivered by Council in partnership with other levels of government, recovery departments, along with local businesses and communities. And this project is one that is dear to my heart. One of the first meetings I had when I was successful in becoming the member of Casey was to meet with the Yarra Ranges Council to get an update on this project that is making a difference and will continue to make a difference in the lives of our residents in this important area. And the Resilience Yarra Ranges project includes proactive tree management and cleanup. It includes plant-based resilience planning and buildings. It's about establishing an emergency relief network and evacuation plans. And this one in particular is really important for our communities because we know when we experienced it in Blacks that day, we experienced it in the June storms, that given the location of our towns and some of the roads that are one way in and one way out, those communities cannot rely on emergency services responses outside of their own town. So it is so important that they have plans for if the emergency comes, but also relief networks that allow them to evacuate before the risk is there if they have that opportunity. And it also allows for a resilient energy precinct. We're doing a program with Monash University in Monbulk to do a microgrid and have the energy there self-sufficient, which again is so important, and we saw it in June. These communities were without power, but they were without access. Emergency services couldn't get in, no one could get out, and we're talking about 100 metres of road completely blocked by trees, and it took significant time, and it's no one's fault other than the reality of dealing with the disaster that we had. But this project will allow those communities to have the power that they need at that time. And crucially, bushfire risk assessments throughout the Dandenong Ranges and Casey, because it is a significant and dangerous bushfire risk. So obviously the Coalition supports programs that effectively promote disaster resilience and risk reduction. Although I must say I do have a few concerns as I look through this legislation. I've not been able to see any information around how the funds will be distributed and no clear definition of what constitutes a mitigation or disaster prevention project. And it's very important that we have that clarity so that this money that we're investing on behalf of our residents and taxpayers is going to make a tangible difference to our communities. I note that the Minister referred to activities such as river gauges and rain modelling as examples, but these are activities of the Bureau of Meteorology, the BOM, not something I would expect the DRF to undertake or to fund. Minister Watt has also mentioned that there will be consultation and guidelines to be held with stakeholders, but cannot say who the stakeholders are or even what the guidelines look like. So again, while this fund and this money is needed and is crucial, it is so important that we get it right, that we're engaging at the community level, because we know in Casey that the community understands their needs better than anyone. So we have to engage like we have through the Resilience Yarra Ranges project with the right stakeholders. We've all seen the devastating floods inundating northern Victoria the last week. And in Casey last week, we had some minor flooding. We were fortunate. We managed to avoid the worst of the damage. Unfortunately, the Yarra Glen football and cricket club rooms were damaged and will need to undergo repair. And just last night, my hometown of Lilydale and the towns of Upwey and Belgrave experienced flash flooding with between 50 to 65 millimetres of rain hitting those towns in about 30 minutes. Left the local SES receiving calls with 12 people trapped in their cars after driving through floodwaters. It's another example of, even in our urban areas, the risk of flood is very real. The power was cut to thousands of homes. Main Street literally looked like a river. And we were lucky, again, to not see any loss of life. But there will be a huge clean-up, and I've spoken to businesses and residents, and I stand by their side and look forward to being able to get home on Friday to see them and support them, because we need to help those businesses that have already had significant challenges in the last 2 years. So I send my heartfelt condolences to those impacted, including my own staff who were impacted, but we're back at work today to support the residents and constituents of Casey. As I said, I'm very much looking forward to getting home and supporting them. The government, as we know, needs to be ready and prepared to act when these significant events occur. We still don't know what the long-term impacts will be, not only for the Victoria and the wider community, and the impacts that it's going to have on food prices and long-term recovery. And we talk about food prices, and it's important to know that it's always our most vulnerable that suffer. So we need to make sure that we're protecting life, we're protecting property, and we're protecting our agricultural bowls. In Casey, we were fortunate last week. I spoke to a farmer the next day after the floods hit, and he'd been up all night, literally defending his property through moving water in pumps and trying to do what he could. He said it got to about 30 centimetres before he was lucky. There was about a 30 centimetre gap before the banks of the river were breached. And if that river had breached, his farm and many others in the Yarra Valley would have been destroyed. And we saw heartbreaking footage in Rochester and other towns of farmers about to pick crops. So that impacts them and the wider community, but it also impacts our most vulnerable through increased prices. So just to be clear, this bill doesn't provide additional money. I'll always support additional money for natural disaster events. And I hope that the government, and they've shown it, but they continue to recognise the urgency and importance of real action, because this is something that needs to be bipartisan, and look forward to supporting this bill and continuing to support the residents of Casey and the nation as we continue to struggle with these natural disasters.